Hello? Yes.
Hello?
Okay.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah, we are all working now. Fantastic. Can you just test your mics once?
Yeah, mine is
Good afternoon and welcome to the session on literary novels and first books. It's called The Novel and the New. And I'm delighted to present to you three very accomplished first-time authors. And it's been a pleasure to go through their work. Very, very diverse voices, very diverse experiences, and equally diverse topics, written with great depth. I will be taking you through Iffat Nawaz and her first book, Shurjo's Clan. It's by Penguin, and it'll be available at the Penguin stall. Anupama Mohan, and Where Mayflies Live Forever. Pan Macmillan, again Hall 1, stall 29, where she'll be signing. And I've got Bernhard Kammel, whose debut novel, again, is available at various bookstore stalls, including, if I'm not mistaken, Oxford Bookstore, also Starmark, where he has signed copies available. And it's called Snow White. So I'm going to start by asking the authors to introduce their own books in their own words. And we'll start with Iffat.
So Shurjo's Clan is about second-hand experiences we carry for generations, from our ancestors that are passed down. Inheritances can be many ways. Usually we talk about material inheritances, but we also have inheritances which are subtle. So Shurjo's Clan is about those inheritances, especially ancestors who have been through war and migration, and how that is passed down to the next generation, and how we kind of process, how it shapes us, and how we work on letting that go and moving beyond it.
If I may ask, throughout your novel, there is this wonderful, magical, but ultimately saddening, unknown world that you created to get your point across. And I found it very unique and very moving. Could you tell us a little bit about it, how you came to think about it, and how it kind of took shape?
Sure, thank you. For me, the unknown world is kind of real in many ways. Growing up in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, I'm born in 1978, about 7-8 years after the liberation war of Bangladesh. And it had this potent energy of those who passed and those who had, were heroes, and it really made our country. And their presence, although they were gone, there was this pran shakti, there was this vital energy that lived around us, and we were taught to really recognize it. And so as a child in the 80s, when I was growing up, it felt like it wasn't just the human bodies, but there were grief-shaped individuals, invisible heroes that lived around us. We were given images, we were given stories as children, which we shouldn't have been reading, but our parents really wanted us to be carrying that, so that they wanted to make sure that their duty was fulfilled, that we knew where we came from. And all of that in a child's mind became magic. And what we felt around was best described as magic. And so when I was writing Shurjo's Clan, the unknown world was the way that I could describe it, because it was very real. At the same time, it was very subtle.
So Bernhard, if you could tell us a little bit about your book, which I found to be a thriller, but you tell me that it didn't begin that way. It began as something you started writing. Could you tell us a bit more?
I just started to write every day some pages, and it was a flow,
Yeah.
an everyday's flow. And the biggest work has been, after finishing the manuscript, to edit it, to cut out, I think I threw away 2/3 of the book and wrote 1/3 freshly. And but there was no design before that I wanted to be a thriller or whatsoever, because for me writing and reading is a sort of it's not a trance, but it is a sort of meditation, a sort of enhancement of awareness, of observing and recepting world or oneself.
So my question here is, it reads very visually, and I could almost sort of visually imagine scene to scene, shot to shot, if I may say so, although I'm not a filmmaker, you are. And I was wondering if it has something to do with your work as a filmmaker and your style of writing, whether they're kind of related with what you've done.
Was your question about the
It
vision?
read very visually.
The vision,
And,
yes.
yeah.
No, it has had nothing to do with the filmmaker. The filmmaking was another output of the same impulse, I would say. It is another tool or another genre. And yes, I have been writing all my life. And filmmaking is a very complex thing, and even an author's film is a product of a huge group of persons. And writing is something when you are alone with you, your conscience, with God, and the aftermath.
So, as an act of personal commune, I mean, sort of, Anupama, you've been a poet, and now you have Where Mayflies Live Forever. And when I was talking to you earlier, you described your writing process not so much as a process, but as this flow that would kind of take over your daily existence. So could you tell us a little bit about what it was like writing your first book?
When I first thought about writing a novel, the title was A Quiet Place, because all I wanted was to have a protagonist who had this incredible noise in their head. It was gender specific at that time. And this protagonist was running out of their own home, a secure space, to find some peace. So that was the first impulse that I had when I was writing. And what I wanted to explore philosophically was what it meant for a human being to come to the limit of some kind of threshold. You know, I thought of it as a kind of limit event, which is a term from space theory for an event that changes one's perception of phenomena entirely. So I wanted to push that protagonist to reach a point of crisis, after which perhaps it would have become difficult, if not impossible, to live. And then the story emerged from there. At that point, it could have been a man, it could have been a woman, as it so transpired. Where Mayflies Live Forever is about a woman who undergoes assault. But my publisher chose to hero this aspect of the novel, and in a way I'm very glad, because more and more readers have been getting back to me, telling me that this is a novel really about connecting with oneself. So the process of writing was for me largely a way to find a connection with oneself. And that self was not myself. I was very clear that I would not write autobiographically. The novel is based in Tamil Nadu. I am not a Tamilian. I do not know Tamil very well. So the novel was entirely, in that sense, a fabrication, for which I had to work very hard, and the process involved a great deal of research, which is where my critical life came in. And I wrote the novel as a writer in residence at the Samyukta Research Center in Trivandrum, where I went for a 3-month period during the height of COVID in Kerala. And my entire family was worried for me. I was worried for myself. But I took the plunge, started writing, and there it was 3 months later, a 200-page thing that was challenging me to do more with it.
So, you know, I found when I was reading your book that despite parts of it that were harrowing and difficult to read, there are segments of immense beauty, immense sensorial pleasure. I mean, I could smell the hair oil you were describing, for instance. And was this a conscious choice? And could you tell us why you chose that particular way of writing, where, you know, you were alternating between this rich sensory world and this other world which was stark and difficult?
You know, for me, reading a novel is almost always about immersion. If a book is not immersive, if it doesn't let you, if it doesn't grab you and take you inside, so much so that you don't want to let go of the book. How many of us remember reading books like that? If it's, the Harry Potter generation, think of your favorite book. It's a book that grabbed you and didn't let you go. And in my mind, I always wanted to write a book that was sensorially an immersive book. And when I started writing, I always knew that I wanted to write a book that drew attention to language, drew attention to the capacity of words to create pictures. So I was thinking very imagistically and wanted to write self-consciously a book that was about word pictures and not simply a book about ideas or about philosophical or abstract thinking. To the best of my capability, I hope I've created a book that has done both, that has enabled a reader to take an abstract idea and see it fleshed out, but that it has also grounded them in the everyday, daily realities of millions of men and women in our country. And for that, I think, for that texturality, a writer has to dig really deep. Earlier, David talked about writers being native, and I think what he meant was to be located specifically,
to be rooted,
memorably.
Perhaps.
Yes, and so that you can separate a writer from another by the texture of their writing, by something that is inimitable. You can see it common among great writers, but you can hear a line and you can hopefully say where this comes from, just like you can tell a Hussein from a Picasso, from a different kind of painter. So the goal was to write something uncategorizable in some ways. That was also a thriller, an eco-fiction, a philosophical meditation, and a reflection of a contemporary reality that all too often gets a very schizophrenic approach, which is we are either silenced by social violence or we are desensitized by it, which amounts to the same over a period of time.
So, I mean, very often, we were discussing this earlier in the lounge, that very often books that are, within quotes, about sexual violence or hard-hitting topics, you get mired into the topic. The book kind of just wallows in it and can't pull itself out. And in both your cases, I found the commonality, Bernhard's genre is a little different, but the commonality here I felt was that it was, the germ was a difficult idea at the core that people are trying to kind of work their way around or heal, so to speak, or address in some way. And then there are conscious techniques taken to essentially not root itself in the pain, but to also have another way out. So since we're discussing this, how important was plot? I mean, how did you plan your plots out extensively, or was it a vision you had and you said, I'm going to sort of follow, my train of thought and just let it come out as an act of meditation almost, as Bernhard was kind of saying. So how did you go about it? Iffat, if you can just, I mean, was plot important?
Absolutely important. My first draft, I was talking about it a bit ago, Jashodhara, that it was heavy. It was another war story, post-war story about trauma and grief. Once and I wrote it with so many emotions, so many subplots, so many characters. I just wanted to tell it all, really. And it was just a jumble of things. I thought I was articulate, but I'm not sure if I was. And it took me about a year and a half. I completely paused after that, and I knew that I had to simplify a lot to really get to the meat of it, to really understand what was my purpose for telling this story. First of all, I quit writing for a while, also thinking it's not important to write another story about 47 and 71 and the aftermath. There's so much about it. Why is this important? So all those inner journeys had to happen. And then really the thought was that how do I turn it towards light? How do I not carry this forward in a way where it just keeps on being a baggage? My first draft, it was still a magic realism, and the protagonist had 6 arms. Basically 6 arms held 6 stories, and how goddesses also carry baggage. So I wanted to drop those arms. I changed the main character to Shurjamukhi, which is sunflower, and turning towards light. It was a reminder for myself to make sure the plot remains about getting lighter in the being. And so that's how I had worked on it and formed it.
So Bernhard, you when we were earlier speaking, you talked about pruning down your initial story, the manuscript, to about maybe 2/3 of its original size. Yeah, you need the mic.
Yes.
So how long did it take you to write your first novel?
I think more than 2 years.
Off and on, and would you sit down every day at your desk and do, typically most authors say they have this routine, there's a particular time when you sit down and you immerse yourself in writing for maybe an hour or so.
I need to keep stress away from me. If I'm not disturbed too much by the world, by geopolitics, by bad fate or sadness of my friends or my family. So when I'm allowed to be myself in peace, then it's enough to lock me in a room and I will start to write. And I do so since ever. This time I wanted to get it published and not to keep all my wonderful sentences by myself. And I think it's not so much about the topic, about the plot, about the story. I think it's more about the attitude, the perception, and things like that. Because I feel the same accelerated awareness when I read certain authors. And when I write, I slip into the same accelerated excitement and perception, and I also in my imagination enter a room with my beloved authors.
And who would they be? I'd love to know who your list of writers for your desert island disc writers would be.
To be mentioned at first would be Franz Kafka, and then maybe Thomas Mann and Heimito von Doderer. And in the English-spoken literature, it would be William Faulkner. And for instance, I share nothing with William Faulkner. I've never ever been in New Orleans or Louisiana. I forgot where he was born, but I have no clue of the southern states background. But when I read Absalon, I was almost crying just for the beauty of every sentence. And I had to stop because it was unbearable. So I have doses every day or every week when I go on with this book. And yes, I hope he feels this.
I think, Anupama, you also talked about the intensity of the way it takes over, the way certain passages are hard to write, just so difficult to get out of your system. If you could tell us a bit more about it.
I also want to quickly respond to the question on plot. I wanted to say for Mayflies, plot was absolutely crucial because I know a lot of people think that the protagonist is Veni and she is the protagonist, but to me as a writer, the protagonist really was the police officer, because the reader gets to see that each chapter really is a witness testimonial. And by the time you finish the novel, you realize that you are reading something that the police officer is hearing. And so I had to capture the
thread.
It's a thread.
The thread that you initially do not realize is the thread.
That's right.
It unfolds beautifully.
So I had to capture the orality of the testimonial along with the textures of writing, which is where the question of style comes in. The question of prosody, poetry comes in. People speak in a very different style than people write. How does a writer address in the written form what is often heard in the spoken form? So those were some of my questions. But of course, plot is also significant because plot is not merely the telling of a story in a line, but plot is the arrangement in a sequence of events that are meaningful to certain kinds of interpretations. So it is precisely that arrangement that I didn't want to be entirely free-flowing, and I wanted, as a writer, to have some control over that. And to add a little bit to what Bernhard said, two writers who do this really well, in my opinion, are Dostoevsky and Faulkner. And I had, as I lay dying in my mind as I wrote this book, and recently among contemporary writers, at least for when I was, the process that I was writing Mayflies, there's this wonderful Mexican writer called Fernanda Melchor, who was shortlisted for the 2020 International Booker. And her book, Hurricane Season, in some ways was a master lesson on how to approach the question of violence itself. And because you say that there are two aspects of the novel, something that's deeply violent, which does not get described a great deal in the novel, and then something that's incredibly beautiful because it's so transient and ephemeral and it surrounds all of us, which is natural beauty, that gets a lot of description. So in a way, Melchor's worldview was at the back of what I was doing, but of course I was doing it for Tamil Nadu. I was choosing an Indian milieu, and I was doing it with language in a very different way. And it was, from the very beginning, I knew that the book had to be as much about language as it was about what language describes.
I think as a reader, what I was struck by was it's as much about, if not more, about beauty than it is about the uglinesses of life, which is so important when you're especially writing about painful things. Amazing. Bernhard, you wanted to respond to...
Yes, I wanted to tie in and agree about the plot, yes, but I would like to sharpen my argument that the plot is the materialization of the spirit, and the spirit comes to you unwillingly. So it is the matter, the plot is the matter, like the stone for the sculptor, but the idea, the identity of the work does not depend on the matter.
So the
So,
core spirit of the book emerges first to you, and
Yes,
then
for me.
then therefore the plot, and therefore the rest of it. I mean, that's what I was trying to understand, because different lenses on it. There's so many different ways to look at it. We have a fair bit of time, and I'm going to hog my speakers for a little bit longer before I open it up out to the audience for questions. But one of the things that's common for all of you when I read your books is that your chapters are bite-sized. The chapters per se are not very long. So that all of them are fast reads. I was reading, so I observed that perhaps even a few decades ago, that was not necessarily the case. Chapters tended to be a lot longer. And earlier on in the lounge, I got asked a very interesting question about what's happening to the literary novel. And one of my observations as a reader, I'd like you to comment on it, is that as the novel continues to ask difficult questions, new novelists are playing with the fact that we may have shorter attention span and are going with bite-sized chapters. I mean, is this true, consciously true? Is this just the way things evolved? Was this, a decision? Iffat, would you like to comment?
I'm not on Twitter, I am, but I'm really bad at it. So I'm not sure if that short form came from the social media influence or the way we want to sort of give things very quickly. But for maybe I can just comment on it that maybe a lot has been told already and we don't want to repeat perhaps. We are assuming that our readers already come from, emotions that were already told by writers before us and authors before us. And so they are aware readers, and therefore not everything has to be explained from zero. And so it's writing from a different space. And I think simplifying always helps, and for me that was the reason. I wanted to have emotions, have potency of it, and I know that if it prolonged too much for too long, then it would just drop. So I wanted to keep it up, and sometimes shorter chapters help me keep that format.
Anupama, yeah.
So my entire novel is rather short, and I think it's fairly unbearable as it is. Whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, the reader will say. But I don't subscribe to the view that attention spans have wavered or lessened. I think they may have diversified. My students read inexorably. They're always reading something. I can't always control what they're reading, but they're reading. And if it's on the mobile phone, then they're reading something on a PDF. So I'm not an alarmist on this count. And at least in my novel, chapter lengths vary. As you know, the Veni chapters are quite long. The testimonials, by the very nature of the genre, are short. And I think a good writer manages to play with attention span as if it was elastic, which it is. To move it around a little bit, to keep it dynamic and fairly orbital. And that was always my goal when I was writing, to play around with the amount of time each character requires of the reader, and then to expand it and explode it in the longer descriptive cave sections, as it were. And it takes a while. I think it takes about 50% of the novel before the reader realizes that there is a play going on here, both with reading but also with immersion. A different kind of had I written a different kind of novel, I would have written a longer novel. So I'm not sure length is a guaranteed predictor of either attention span or the ability to convey something in great detail. I think we can all think of short stories or short novels that packed such a punch that you were left reeling for a long time. And I have struggled with Zola over pages and pages of a description of a small mole on the face, which could have been wrapped up into 2 paragraphs or something at best, right? So length not necessarily But I think the ability to play with length is a vital talent for a writer, I think.
It's really interesting to get a craft perspective on the novel, because typically, I think a lot of, the reader's lens is often, I like this, I don't like this, oh, I loved that, or I couldn't get through to this bit. But when we kind of sit here and we have the privilege of learning about the craft behind it, the thought behind it, it's really quite amazing. All of you have so many different identities. Bernhard, as many of you might know, is creative in multiple ways. He's a director, he's obviously now a writer, he's a filmmaker, he's got a beautiful light to his name. It's called The Reactor. Do look it up. How would you describe your typical creative day? Do you go from project to project? Is it impulse to impulse? Is it more by design? How do you toggle between your different identities?
These different identities helps me to be fresh when I leave one and slip into the next. So I usually serve several days on one project and then slip into the next project. But this was not so when I wrote the book. It is since I not only started to write the book but finished it, and I knew I must finish it. I had no choice not to finish it. Since this moment, I realized that I put away all other things. So I'm also breeding horses, and I think I haven't sit on a horseback for 3 years now, or just 1 or 2 times, and I try to delegate other jobs to other persons of my trust. Sometimes it works out very well, sometimes not.
So you found that writing was essentially quite different from your other projects, and you had to kind of do it in one shot. You immersed yourself. Was it like, did you not work on other projects while you did it? Because I think as an academic,
No.
Anupama.
No. When I shoot a film, I too cannot interrupt this process. It's also a 2 years written, but in between I have time to slip on the weekend, or so I have never holidays or weekends or evenings. I'm always online in my efforts to improve in percepting world. And but the fact that I have several identities makes it easier to me to work all the time, but not getting tired for it. Well, when I step into another work.
So one project to another, and sort of each one energizes you for the next.
Yes.
And Anupama, I was thinking, academia and writing, they're both so intense, and you do both. So how do you work around it, or do you have like a way?
It's not a problem for me. They feed each other, my critical and creative selves. But when I write as a creative writer, I have to write with intensity, in a certain kind of way. Earlier, I think David mentioned, you have to be steeped in literature. You have to be reading a great deal. So actually have long fallow periods where I only read and think And I write in a rush, in a welter, and it's kind of an assault, not only on my senses, but on everything around me. And so that is not a luxury that an academic has. And I think the only reason it happened is because the pandemic created this kind of a crisis situation. One felt mortal on an everyday basis. And I felt like if I didn't write now, I possibly would never write. I've already had this question, although I'm in my early 40s. Someone has already asked me, why so late? And I said, late creativity is a thing, and I couldn't believe it because I listened to Giuseppe Verdi as well, and Verdi was my emblem for late creativity. His first work started in the 60s, you know, but I think most people think of John Keats and Schubert and so on as very young prodigies. And I do think youth is a very important time for impressions. But for me, I think overall life has been fallow in terms of how I've taken on impressions, but my writing process also has long periods of fallow with nothing to show for it, and then bursts of intense writing and hopefully good writing, and then again periods of fallow. But when I say fallow, I only mean I'm not writing. It doesn't mean I'm not reading or thinking. So
I totally understand, but I mean, sometimes it's just cooking at the back of your head, and for extended periods. I mean, as someone I'm older than you, I'm 50 something, so there's hope for me yet. But Iffat, I'm going to come to you. You were saying that your novel would not have read the way it does today had it not been for your stint at Sri Aurobindo Ashram. And I wanted to kind of know a little bit more, and I wanted the audience to hear a bit about why it was so.
Sure. So, in 2018, when the year I was turning 40, speaking of starting late, I had moved I was working for refugee crises, a few of them, and finally decided to resign from my crazy jobs and take some time off. And I was doing a lot of Vipassana meditation before that, 10 days of silence here and there. And there was a spiritual calling, and I landed up in Pondicherry not knowing anything, nothing to do with Sri Aurobindo at all. But there were lots of questions on my mind, and lots of sort of inner turmoil. And at that time, being there by the Bay of Bengal and being in the ashram community, actually more in the samadhi, really helped me calm myself in ways I needed to. And so before that, my identity was about the fire I was born with and how to get that fire out and really be this passionate, person who were, from a country of heroes or family of that and so forth. That was what I was carrying. And then until I came, then I wrote my first draft, which came from that fire and the passion and the anger and trying to prove myself and where I come from. And then being there quietly for longer, learning about atavism, what we carry and how do we move forward. I understood that it was just the connection of the spirituality and this book was very close. And I find that each book is basically a vital cage. You enter it, it's a writer's cage. You go into it, you read it, and you come out with what you want. I didn't want to create a cage that had very hard, bindings. So being at Sri Aurobindo Ashram, which is very spacious and for the mind and the soul, it helped me move or break some of those identity that I was carrying, characteristics I was carrying. So that's really what I meant by that, and figuring out. And for me, altruism, humanitarian crises, all these things happened because I thought I had to give beyond and work for non-profits and so forth to be a good person. But then I realized that there were a lot that I needed to work on, a lot of self-healing that had to happen while this book was being written. I want to give also a shout out to David Davidar. I had met him 10 years ago in Bangladesh, and I was an aspiring writer back then. And I remember he was telling me that write only what you have experienced. Write from your own experience. Write about, you ran a marathon, write about that, And I was really thinking about what that might be. And I think it took me a long time to understand that this was an experience that I could write about, but in a way that was fictional and magical. So yeah, there were, people on the way that definitely helped.
Jashodhara Di, we've run out of time.
Yeah, I think we're kind of out of time. I was about to just see that because I just realized belatedly that my watch has stopped. Thank you for being a wonderfully keen and interested audience. I'd like to thank my panelists yet again, Bernhard, Anupama, Iffat. The books are available, as I said, in hall number 1, Penguin, Pan Macmillan. You know your way around the Boimala. And for Bernhard's copies, you need to go to Oxford Bookstore and Starmark for a start, right? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
We'd just like to take a moment for Shujata Di to hand over a token of her appreciation to all our panelists. All right, it's time for our new session, and I'm particularly looking forward to this one. It's called A New History of India. It has Rudrangshu Mukherjee in conversation with David Davidar. Rudrangshu Mukherjee is a distinguished historian who is currently the Chancellor of Ashoka University. His illustrious academic career includes his teaching stint with the University of Calcutta and visiting appointments at Princeton University, the University of Manchester, and the University of California. He has written several books, notable among which are Nehru and Bose, Parallel Lives, Spectre of Violence, the 1857 Kanpur massacres, and the Oxford India Short Introduction to Jawaharlal Nehru. He has also published numerous essays in journals of national and international repute. David Davidar is an award-winning publisher, novelist, and anthologist. He was a founding member of Penguin India and later the company's CEO and publisher. In 2011, he co-founded Aleph Book Company, a literary publishing firm that won the Publisher of the Year award in 2021. He has written several best-selling and award-winning books, such as The House of Blue Mangoes, The Solitude of Emperors, and of course, A Case of Indian Marvels. So, I would like to welcome Rudrangshuda and David on stage to talk about Rudrangshu Mukherjee's new book, A New History of India.